The security camera footage would later show exactly 14 seconds. 14 seconds during which a middle-aged custodian transformed into something that defied every assumption the corporate world had made about invisible people. 14 seconds that would rewrite the definition of heroism and expose the dangerous gap between privilege and competence. But those 14 seconds came at the end of a story that began 12 years earlier, when Major Sarah Ghost Mitchell disappeared from the world and Sarah Mitchell the janitor was born from necessity, survival, and a betrayal so profound it had shattered everything she once believed about honor and justice. The morning it all changed started like any other Tuesday in downtown Denver. Coffee shops filled with executives discussing million-dollar deals. Traffic flowed in predictable patterns toward glass towers that housed America's financial future. And in the basement of Phoenix Financial Tower, a woman in faded coveralls checked her cleaning supplies while mentally cataloging security vulnerabilities that could cost hundreds of lives. She had no idea that before sunset, she would be forced to choose between the safety of anonymity and the moral weight of watching innocent people die, while possessing the skills to save them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's mechanical buzzing pierced the pre-dawn silence at 4:30 a.m. Though Sarah Mitchell had been awake for nearly an hour, lying motionless in the narrow bed while her mind performed the threat assessment routine that had become as automatic as breathing. The studio apartment in Aurora revealed nothing about its occupant that would interest curious neighbors or casual observers. Discount furniture arranged with utilitarian efficiency, generic artwork purchased from department store clearance sales, and the kind of impersonal cleanliness that suggested someone who viewed their living space as temporary shelter rather than a home. Sarah's morning routine unfolded with the mechanical precision of someone who had reduced life to its essential elements. Shower in under 5 minutes using generic soap and shampoo. Coffee prepared in a basic drip machine while reviewing the day's weather forecast and traffic patterns on a small television whose antenna required constant adjustment. Breakfast consisting of toast and scrambled eggs consumed while standing at the kitchen counter, her eyes automatically scanning the parking lot through blinds that were positioned to provide surveillance while blocking incoming observation. The woman who emerged from the apartment building at 5:15 a.m. bore no resemblance to the elite operator who had once commanded respect in the world's most dangerous places. Sarah had deliberately added 30 pounds to her frame, the extra weight, softening military bearing into the unremarkable posture of someone who had learned to accept rather than command. Her brown hair hung limp around her shoulders, unwashed and unstyled in deliberate contrast to the precisely maintained appearance that had once been required by military regulations. Contact lenses changed her pale blue eyes to common brown, while carefully applied makeup created shadows and lines that aged her beyond her 38 years. The bus ride to downtown Denver took 45 minutes, providing Sarah with time to observe fellow passengers while maintaining the careful facade of someone lost in mundane concerns. She carried a paperback romance novel with a garish cover, occasionally turning pages while actually monitoring conversations and behavioral patterns that her training had taught her to analyze automatically. The businessman in the 4th row spoke too loudly about confidential merger negotiations. The college student near the back displayed expensive electronics without awareness of the predatory attention she was attracting. The elderly woman by the window counted prescription medications with shaking hands that suggested medical conditions requiring careful management. Sarah's peripheral vision tracked these details while her conscious mind practiced the kind of deliberate incompetence that had become essential to her survival. She missed her stop twice during the first month, establishing herself as someone who required extra time and assistance to navigate basic transportation systems. She asked obvious questions about bus schedules and routes, creating an impression of someone whose mental capabilities matched her humble circumstances. Most importantly, she cultivated relationships with other regular passengers that were friendly but shallow, providing social camouflage without creating opportunities for deeper scrutiny of her background or capabilities. Phoenix Financial Tower dominated the Denver skyline with the aggressive confidence of late 20th century corporate architecture, its steel and glass facade reflecting the morning sun in patterns that created brief moments of blinding glare for approaching vehicles. The building housed Pinnacle Investment Group's headquarters, along with dozens of smaller financial firms, law offices, and consulting companies that served the investment industry. Security checkpoints at the main entrance created an impression of sophisticated protection while actually providing minimal defense against determined adversaries who understood the difference between theater and actual threat mitigation. Sarah entered through the employee entrance, her access card triggering electronic logs that recorded her arrival time with bureaucratic precision. The security guard who processed her entry knew her only as the quiet cleaning woman who worked the overnight shift, someone so unremarkable that he often forgot her presence within minutes of her passage through his checkpoint. She exchanged polite nods with Marcus, whose habit of reading mystery novels during quiet periods had provided her with conversation topics that reinforced her cover as someone interested in simple entertainment rather than complex analysis. The janitorial supply room occupied a forgotten corner of the building's basement level, its concrete walls and fluorescent lighting creating the institutional atmosphere common to service areas that remained invisible to corporate tenants. Sarah collected her cleaning cart and supplies with movements that appeared routine, but actually served multiple intelligence-gathering purposes. The cart's contents provided her with legitimate reasons to access every floor of the building, while the supplies themselves could be repurposed into improvised tools or weapons if circumstances required such adaptations. Her work assignment for the evening focused on the executive floors, where Pinnacle's senior management conducted business that affected billions of dollars in global investments. Sarah had requested these assignments specifically because they provided access to information and security systems that would be valuable for threat assessment purposes, though she carefully framed her interest in terms of earning overtime pay rather than professional curiosity about corporate operations. The elevator ride to the 35th floor passed in silence, giving Sarah time to review the mental map she had developed of the building's layout over 3 years of systematic observation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She knew the location of every emergency exit, the specifications of every communication system, and the daily patterns of every security guard. This knowledge was cataloged automatically by training that had once made her one of America's most effective special operations soldiers, but it remained unused and unshared because revealing such awareness would expose capabilities inconsistent with her assumed identity. The executive conference room still bore traces of the previous day's board meeting, with coffee cups and presentation materials scattered across a mahogany table that probably cost more than Sarah earned in 6 months. She began cleaning with the methodical efficiency that had earned her reputation as a reliable employee, while her trained awareness automatically processed information that could provide insights into Pinnacle's business operations and security vulnerabilities. The documents left behind revealed details about upcoming merger negotiations that would require heightened security protocols, international investments in regions where political instability created risks for American corporate interests, and personnel changes that could affect the company's protective posture. Sarah photographed nothing and removed nothing, but her memory retained information that intelligence operatives would have paid substantial sums to obtain. The irony of her situation was not lost on her, the woman entrusted with cleaning up, after high-level business discussions, possessed analytical capabilities that exceeded those of most corporate security directors. Robert Chun's corner office presented additional challenges for someone trying to maintain operational security while performing custodial duties. His personal computer remained logged into systems that controlled billions of dollars in financial transactions, its screensaver displaying market data that updated in real time. His desk contained handwritten notes about confidential negotiations and strategic plans that could move markets if disclosed to competitors or hostile governments. His phone system showed missed calls from international contacts whose names appeared on Treasury Department watch lists. Sarah cleaned around these security failures while resisting the urge to address vulnerabilities that could be exploited by sophisticated adversaries. Her training had taught her to identify and neutralize threats to American interests, but her circumstances prevented her from acting on observations that could prevent economic espionage or terrorist financing. The knowledge that her skills could protect national security while her cover story prevented intervention created constant tension between her true nature and her assumed limitations. The building's security office occupied a prime location on the 35th floor, its windows providing panoramic views of downtown Denver, while its interior revealed the gap between appearance and reality that characterized Pinnacle's protective measures. Brad Stevens had decorated his workspace with framed certificates from various training programs and trade associations, credentials that looked impressive to uninformed observers, but represented minimal educational value to anyone familiar with serious security training. Sarah's cleaning duties in Stevens' office provided her with regular access to information that revealed the scope of his professional limitations and the vulnerabilities they created for everyone in the building. His computer screens displayed monitoring systems that covered public areas while missing critical security zones, where attackers could position themselves for maximum advantage. His desk contained vendor proposals for security equipment that emphasized impressive specifications rather than operational effectiveness. His bookshelf held popular press volumes about corporate security written for general audiences rather than professional practitioners. The contrast between Stevens' self-perception and his actual capabilities became apparent to anyone with genuine security expertise who observed his daily operations. His threat assessments consisted largely of statistics copied from insurance industry publications rather than original analysis of risk specific to Pinnacle's business model and geographic location. His emergency procedures assumed that external responders would handle any serious incidents, with minimal consideration of response times or coordination requirements during major crisis situations. Sarah had observed Stevens' interactions with other employees over 3 years, watching him demonstrate the casual cruelty that often characterized people who had achieved positions of authority through connections rather than competence. His treatment of custodial staff revealed assumptions about social hierarchy that made him vulnerable to manipulation by adversaries who understood how prejudice could be exploited to gain access and gather intelligence. The overnight security guard who worked Stevens' department was Tommy Rodriguez, a young veteran whose military background created both opportunities and risks for Sarah's operational security. Rodriguez's questions about building security and emergency procedures demonstrated genuine professional interest that Stevens interpreted as challenges to his authority. Sarah had to carefully balance her natural inclination to encourage Rodriguez's development with the necessity of maintaining her cover as someone lacking relevant expertise. Rodriguez's presence in the building created additional complexity for Sarah's situation, because his military training might enable him to recognize inconsistencies in her cover story or behavioral patterns that suggested more extensive tactical knowledge than she claimed to possess. She managed this risk by limiting their interactions to brief, professional exchanges while carefully monitoring his reactions to determine whether he suspected her true background. The custodial staff who worked alongside Sarah came from diverse backgrounds that reflected the economic realities facing working-class Americans in major metropolitan areas. Maria Gonzalez supervised a day-shift cleaning crew with the competence and integrity that reminded Sarah of the non-commissioned officers who had formed the backbone of military organizations. Her respectful treatment of all building occupants, regardless of their position, created an environment where Sarah could practice being valued for simple, human decency rather than professional achievement. The relationships Sarah had developed with her co-workers provided essential social camouflage while requiring constant vigilance to prevent exposure of information that could compromise her assumed identity. She participated in casual conversations about family problems, financial struggles, and workplace frustrations while carefully avoiding topics that might reveal education or experience inconsistent with her cover story. These interactions were necessarily shallow but provided the human connections that prevented complete social isolation. Sarah's financial situation reflected the careful balance between maintaining her cover and preserving resources for potential emergencies. Her custodial salary provided enough income to cover basic living expenses while leaving minimal excess that might suggest additional income sources. She shopped at discount stores, used public transportation, and avoided expenditures that could attract attention from anyone monitoring her activities. Her bank account showed exactly the financial pattern that someone in her circumstances would be expected to display. But this apparent poverty concealed resources that Sarah had accumulated through means that would not appear in official records. She possessed precious metals that could be converted to cash without creating paper trails, cryptocurrency accounts that provided access to funds without banking oversight, and emergency supplies that would enable her to disappear quickly if her cover was compromised. These preparations represented her insurance against the possibility that hostile forces might discover her location and attempt to eliminate a witness to their previous operations. The physical conditioning that had once been essential to her survival in combat zones now served the dual purpose of maintaining her health while providing psychological outlets for stress and frustration. Sarah's pre-dawn runs through Aurora's empty streets allowed her to monitor her neighborhood for surveillance while maintaining the cardiovascular fitness that special operations had demanded. She varied her routes randomly, never establishing patterns that could be exploited by hostile observation, while maintaining the appearance of someone exercising for basic fitness rather than tactical preparation. Her apartment contained exercise equipment hidden in ways that would not attract attention from neighbors who might wonder why a custodian possessed the physical capabilities of a professional athlete. She practiced martial arts forms in the darkness before dawn, maintaining muscle memory and reflexes that she hoped never to need again, while acknowledging that such skills might become necessary if circumstances forced her to abandon her peaceful existence. The weapons cache concealed within her apartment's walls represented Sarah's final insurance policy against threats that could not be addressed through legal means or passive evasion. She possessed firearms that could not be traced to her current identity, ammunition sufficient for extended confrontations, and tactical equipment that would allow her to operate effectively if forced to abandon her cover. These preparations violated numerous laws, but reflected her assessment that legal compliance was less important than survival if her carefully constructed anonymity was compromised. Sarah's information management practices balanced the need for situational awareness with the requirements of operational security. She monitored news reports for developments that might affect her safety, tracked personnel changes within military and intelligence communities that could create new threats, and maintained awareness of geopolitical situations that might motivate foreign services to target former American operators. This intelligence was gathered through anonymous internet access and open source materials that could not be traced to her identity. The psychological discipline required to suppress competence and initiative that had once defined her professional identity created ongoing internal conflicts that threatened her emotional stability. Sarah had been trained to identify problems and develop solutions, to take charge of situations requiring leadership, to act decisively when circumstances demanded. Immediate response. Now she practiced deliberate mediocrity, accepting inefficiencies and vulnerabilities that she could easily address while maintaining the facade of someone whose capabilities matched her humble circumstances. This psychological suppression created tensions that sometimes overwhelmed her carefully maintained equilibrium. Sarah observed security failures that could cost lives, witnessed incompetence that endangered innocent people, and encountered situations where her expertise could prevent disasters, all while remaining passive and unremarkable. The knowledge that her skills could make a difference while her circumstances prevented action created a form of moral injury that she had not anticipated when designing her new identity. But she had also discovered unexpected sources of satisfaction in her reduced circumstances. The routine nature of custodial work provided stability that had been absent during her military career, when each mission brought unknown challenges requiring constant adaptation. The absence of life and death responsibility, while frustrating to her protective instincts, provided relief from the constant pressure that had characterized her former existence as a special operations leader. Sarah had learned to find meaning in small accomplishments and simple human interactions, measuring success by her ability to remain undetected rather than by missions accomplished or lives saved. She took satisfaction in maintaining clean and safe environments for building occupants who would never know her name or appreciate her efforts. She found purpose in honest work honestly performed, even though such employment represented a dramatic reduction from her former responsibilities and capabilities. The 12 years she had spent constructing and maintaining this careful existence had taught her that identity was more flexible than she had previously understood. The woman who cleaned offices and emptied trash cans was no less real than the major who had once commanded elite soldiers in combat operations, even though their capabilities and circumstances differed dramatically. Sarah had learned to inhabit both identities simultaneously, drawing strength from her former self while accepting the limitations imposed by her current situation. But this equilibrium depended on circumstances that allowed her to remain invisible and unremarkable. Sarah understood that events beyond her control could shatter the peaceful existence she had built, forcing her to choose between the safety of her assumed limitations and the moral responsibility that came with possessing capabilities that could save innocent lives. She had hoped that such choices would never be necessary, that she could live her remaining years in quiet anonymity, without facing situations that demanded the skills she had worked so hard to suppress. The morning news broadcasts that would change everything were still hours away, but Sarah's trained intuition had already begun detecting subtle changes in routine patterns and personnel behavior that suggested something significant was approaching. Her hypervigilance, carefully modulated to avoid attracting attention, had identified anomalies in building security procedures and unusual activities among executive staff that indicated preparations for events beyond normal business operations. The instincts that had kept her alive in hostile territories were warning her that the careful balance of her hidden existence was about to be tested in ways that would force her to confront the fundamental question of who she really was and what she was willing to sacrifice to protect innocent people from threats they could not imagine. The cramped studio apartment in Aurora held no photographs, no awards, no remnants of a life that had once commanded respect across 3 continents. Sarah Mitchell had methodically erased Major Sarah Ghost Mitchell from existence 12 years ago, burying that identity beneath layers of manufactured documentation and deliberate mediocrity. The only reminder of her former life sat hidden beneath loose floorboards near the kitchenette, a small metal box containing a purple heart, a silver star, and a folded American flag that had once draped the coffin of someone she'd failed to save. Major Sarah Mitchell had been the youngest woman ever selected for Delta Force, earning her call sign Ghost not through stealth alone, but through her uncanny ability to infiltrate hostile territories and extract high-value targets without leaving a trace. Her psychological profile had noted an unusual combination of tactical brilliance and emotional intelligence that made her equally effective at reading enemy behavior and managing complex rescue operations. For 8 years, she had operated in the shadows of America's most classified missions, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the urban battlefields of Eastern Europe. The mission that destroyed everything had taken place in the fictional nation of Moldavia, a former Soviet satellite state torn apart by ethnic conflicts and controlled by warlords who profited from chaos. American intelligence had identified a compound where 3 journalists and a humanitarian aid worker were being held by Viktor Kozlov, a former Spetsnaz operative turned arms dealer. The hostages had been captured while investigating rumors of chemical weapons being smuggled through Moldavian territory into Syria. Sarah's team consisted of 6 operators, each hand-picked for their specific expertise. Sergeant First Class Mike Thompson served as her second-in-command, a demolitions expert whose steady demeanor balanced Sarah's intensity. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Cruz handled communications and electronic warfare, while Technical Sergeant David Park specialized in close-quarters combat. The team's medic, Sergeant Marcus Williams, could perform field surgery under fire, and their sniper, Staff Sergeant Lisa Chun, could place shots within millimeters at distances exceeding 800 meters. The intelligence package had come from Colonel James Parker, Sarah's former mentor at Fort Bragg and the officer responsible for her rapid advancement through Special Operations Command. Parker had built his reputation on running successful black operations, gathering intelligence through networks of assets that spanned from Moscow to Tehran. His briefings were legendary for their precision and accuracy, making him one of the most trusted intelligence officers in the Special Operations community. Parker's briefing had painted a clear picture of the target compound, a former Soviet military installation 40 kilometers northeast of Moldavia's capital, minimally guarded and accessible through a drainage system that connected to the nearby Drava River. Satellite imagery showed 2 guards at the main entrance, with thermal scans indicating approximately 12 heat signatures inside the main building. The hostages were believed to be held in the basement level, with Kozlov maintaining a small security force of former military personnel who were more interested in profit than ideology. The mission parameters were straightforward: infiltrate the compound during the early morning hours when guard effectiveness would be at its lowest, neutralize hostile forces with minimal noise, extract the 4 hostages, and disappear before dawn. Exfiltration would occur via helicopter from a landing zone 3 kilometers from the compound, with air support available if the situation deteriorated beyond acceptable parameters. Sarah had spent 3 weeks preparing for the operation, studying the compound's layout until she could navigate it blindfolded, analyzing guard patterns from surveillance footage, and rehearsing the mission with her team until every movement became instinctive. She developed contingency plans for 17 different scenarios, from equipment failure to unexpected enemy reinforcements. Her psychological assessment of Kozlov suggested a pragmatic criminal more concerned with preserving his operation than fighting to the death over 4 hostages. The insertion had proceeded flawlessly. Sarah's team had approached through the drainage system as planned, emerging inside the compound's perimeter without triggering any alarms. The guards at the Vizint main entrance were neutralized silently, their communications equipment disabled to prevent warnings. Thermal imaging confirmed the hostages' location in the basement, while motion sensors indicated that most of the compound's occupants were asleep in barracks located in a separate building. But as Sarah's team moved through the main building toward the basement access, the mission began to unravel in ways that no amount of planning could have anticipated. The thermal scans had missed a sophisticated alarm system that detected their presence the moment they entered the main corridor. Emergency lighting flooded the building as steel doors automatically sealed the exits, trapping Sarah's team inside a kill zone that had been designed specifically for such an infiltration attempt. The intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. Instead of 12 lightly armed guards, the compound housed 43 heavily equipped mercenaries, many of them former Special Forces operators from various nations who had gravitated toward Kozlov's organization for the substantial financial rewards. The drainage system that was supposed to provide covert access had been monitored by motion sensors that fed directly to a central security station. Most damaging of all, the hostages weren't in the basement, they were being held in a completely different facility 30 kilometers away, making the entire operation pointless even if Sarah's team could somehow escape alive. The firefight that followed tested every aspect of Sarah's training and leadership. Trapped in an unfamiliar building with overwhelming enemy forces converging on their position, she had to make split-second decisions that would determine whether her team survived the next 5 minutes. The basement that intelligence had identified as the hostage location became their temporary stronghold, its thick concrete walls providing protection from the grenades and automatic weapons fire that echoed through the corridors above. Sarah coordinated her team's defense with the precision of a conductor directing a symphony of violence. Thompson used his demolitions expertise to create choke points that funneled enemy forces into predetermined kill zones, while Cruz jammed communications to prevent the mercenaries from coordinating their assault effectively. Park and Chun established overlapping fields of fire that made advancement toward their position prohibitively costly, and Williams treated wounds while maintaining accurate suppressing fire. For 6 hours, Sarah's team held their position against increasingly desperate attempts to overrun their defenses. She rotated personnel to prevent exhaustion, managed ammunition distribution to ensure sustained firepower, and maintained communication with extraction assets despite Cruz's equipment being damaged by shrapnel. Her calm voice over the radio became an anchor of stability for operators who could see their situation deteriorating with each enemy assault. The breakthrough came when Sarah realized that the compound's emergency power system, designed to maintain critical systems during attacks, could be turned against their enemies. Using Thompson's explosives and her own knowledge of Soviet-era electrical systems, she orchestrated a coordinated assault that plunged half the compound into darkness while simultaneously creating multiple breach points that confused enemy forces. About the team's actual location, the extraction was a masterpiece of tactical coordination under extreme pressure. Sarah led her team through a running firefight that covered 800 meters of open ground, using smoke grenades and diversionary explosives to mask their movement, while Chun provided precision sniper fire that eliminated key threats. The helicopter extraction occurred under heavy fire, with Sarah being the last person to board as bullets shattered the aircraft's windows around her. But the mission's successful extraction couldn't hide its fundamental failure. 4 innocent people remained in captivity because the intelligence that had driven the entire operation was worse than useless. It was deliberately falsified. Sarah's after-action report raised serious questions about the source of the flawed intelligence, particularly the discrepancies between Parker's briefing materials and the reality they'd encountered on the ground. The investigation that followed revealed the horrifying truth about Colonel Parker's intelligence networks. For over 3 years, he had been selling operational details to hostile foreign intelligence services, trading American lives for deposits in Swiss bank accounts. The Moldavian operation had been a trap from the beginning, designed to eliminate Sarah's team while providing Kozlov with valuable intelligence about American special operations capabilities. Parker's betrayal went far beyond simple greed. He had systematically compromised dozens of operations, leading to the deaths of 17 American operators and countless foreign assets who had trusted their lives to American promises of protection. The 4 hostages in Moldavia had been moved specifically because Parker had informed Kozlov of the impending rescue attempt. turning what should have been a straightforward extraction into an elaborate ambush. The evidence against Parker was overwhelming, but his connections within the intelligence community and his reputation for successful operations created institutional resistance to acknowledging the scope of his treachery. Senior officials who had built their careers on Parker's intelligence were reluctant to admit that their achievements were based on information purchased with American blood. The investigation became politicized, with career considerations trumping justice for the operators who had died because of Parker's betrayal. Sarah found herself caught in a bureaucratic nightmare that transformed her from a decorated hero into a convenient scapegoat. Her detailed after-action reports were dismissed as attempts to deflect blame for the mission's failure. Her psychological evaluations were reinterpreted to suggest instability and poor judgment under pressure. Most damaging of all, Parker's supporters within the command structure began circulating rumors that Sarah had compromised the mission through operational security failures. The court-martial proceedings were a masterclass in institutional cover-up. Disguised as military justice, Parker, who should have been the primary defendant, was quietly transferred to a desk job at the Pentagon while Sarah faced charges of reckless endangerment, failure to follow proper protocols, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The evidence of Parker's betrayal was classified at levels that prevented Sarah's defense team from accessing the information needed to prove her innocence. Character witnesses who attempted to testify on Sarah's behalf found themselves reassigned to remote locations or encouraged to retire early. The operators who had served under her command were forbidden from discussing classified operations, effectively silencing the people who could have provided first-hand testimony about her competence and integrity. The institutional machinery that had once celebrated Sarah's achievements now worked systematically to destroy her reputation and career. The final blow came when the 4 hostages from the original Moldavian operation were found dead in a mass grave, executed shortly after Sarah's team's failed rescue attempt. Parker's supporters used their deaths to argue that Sarah's operational failures had cost innocent lives, conveniently ignoring the fact that their deaths were the direct result of Parker's betrayal. The media narrative painted Sarah as a reckless operator whose mistakes had tragic consequences, while Parker's role in the debacle remained hidden behind layers of classification. Sarah's conviction was foreordained by political necessity rather than legal evidence. She was stripped of her rank, dishonorably discharged, and sentenced to 3 years in military prison. Her commendations were revoked, her security clearance permanently revoked, and her name entered into databases that would prevent her from ever working in law enforcement or security again. The woman who had once been considered one of America's most capable special operators became a pariah within the very community that had once celebrated her achievements. The years in military prison were a journey through a special kind of hell designed for those who had worn the uniform with distinction. Before their fall from grace, Sarah was housed with deserters, thieves, and soldiers who had committed crimes that brought dishonor to the service. The guards who had once saluted officers like her now treated her with the contempt reserved for those who had betrayed their oath. Her days were filled with menial labor and mandatory counseling sessions, designed to break down her sense of identity and rebuild her as a compliant member of society. But prison also provided Sarah with time to develop the skills that would allow her to disappear completely upon her release. She studied legal procedures for identity changes, memorized techniques for altering physical appearance, and learned the bureaucratic processes necessary to obtain legitimate employment documentation under an assumed name. Her cellmate during the final year was a former CIA operative who had been convicted of embezzlement and who taught Sarah the tradecraft necessary to maintain a deep cover identity indefinitely. The transformation from Major Sarah Mitchell to Co. Sarah Mitchell, unemployed veteran seeking entry-level work, required more than just paperwork and physical changes. Sarah had to learn to suppress the confidence and competence that had once defined her. to accept disrespect without retaliation, to blend into backgrounds where she had once commanded attention. She practiced walking with less purpose, speaking with less authority, and reacting to challenges with deference rather than decisive action. Upon her release, Sarah implemented her carefully developed plan for complete reinvention. She relocated to Denver, a city large enough to provide anonymity, but small enough to avoid the sophisticated surveillance networks that monitored major coastal cities. She obtained documentation under her new identity, established a credit history through careful use of secured credit cards, and slowly built the paper trail that would support her cover story as a former military mechanic seeking stable employment. The custodial position at Pinnacle Investment Group represented more than just a paycheck. It was the perfect cover for someone who needed to remain invisible while maintaining access to information networks. Night shift work meant minimal contact with corporate personnel, while the building's security systems and communication infrastructure provided opportunities to monitor potential threats to her carefully constructed anonymity. Her military training made her naturally observant of security weaknesses and personnel patterns, knowledge that she kept carefully hidden beneath the persona of a diligent but unremarkable cleaning woman. For 12 years, Sarah had maintained this delicate balance between her true capabilities and her assumed limitations. She watched as incompetent security directors like Brad Stevens built careers on political connections rather than professional competence, knowing that she could design better protective procedures in her sleep, but unable to offer suggestions without risking exposure. She endured daily condescension from people whose lives she could have saved in dozens of different crisis scenarios, accepting their dismissal as the price of her continued freedom. The irony of her situation was not lost on Sarah, the woman who had once been entrusted with America's most sensitive operations, now mopped floors and emptied trash cans, her extensive knowledge of crisis management and tactical operations hidden beneath the uniform of the invisible working class. She knew the building's security vulnerabilities better than the people paid to protect it, understood the psychological profiles of potential threats better than the consultants hired to assess them, and possessed crisis response capabilities that exceeded those of entire police departments. But knowledge without the authority to act was its own form of torture. Sarah watched as Pinnacle Investment Group's security measures failed to address obvious weaknesses that she could have identified and corrected in a matter of hours. She observed the personnel dynamics that created opportunities for insider threats, noted the communication failures that would prove catastrophic in an emergency, and recognized the overconfidence that would make the building's occupants vulnerable to the kind of sophisticated attack that she had once specialized in preventing. The metal box hidden beneath her apartment's floorboards contained more than just military decorations. It held the last physical reminders of a time when her skills had served a purpose larger than herself. The Purple Heart had been awarded for wounds received during a hostage rescue in Afghanistan, where she had absorbed shrapnel while shielding a wounded teammate. The Silver Star commemorated her actions during a raid in Iraq, where she had single-handedly eliminated a cell of insurgents who had been planning attacks on American forces. The folded flag had been presented to her by General Patricia Hayes during a private ceremony that acknowledged Sarah's contributions to operations too classified for public recognition. Hayes had been one of the few senior officers who had attempted to defend Sarah during the court-martial proceedings, but even her influence had been insufficient to overcome the institutional momentum that demanded a scapegoat for Parker's betrayal. Now Sarah existed in a liminal space between her former life and her assumed identity, maintaining the skills that had once made her invaluable while accepting the reality that those skills would never again serve their intended purpose. She ran 10 miles every morning through Denver's empty streets, maintaining the physical conditioning that had been essential to her survival in hostile environments. She practiced marksmanship at remote shooting ranges, keeping her reflexes sharp despite knowing that she would never again carry a weapon in service of her country. The psychological cost of this existence was immeasurable. Sarah had once been part of an elite community where competence was valued, sacrifice was honored, and mission accomplishment was the highest virtue. Now she moved through a world where mediocrity was rewarded, where political connections mattered more than professional excellence, and where the people entrusted with protecting others often lacked the basic skills necessary to protect themselves. But perhaps the most painful aspect of her hidden existence was the knowledge that somewhere in the world, people were dying because the skills and experience that could save them remained locked away behind the facade of a night shift custodian. Every terrorist attack, every botched hostage rescue, every security failure that resulted in innocent casualties represented opportunities where her expertise could have made the difference between tragedy and triumph. Sarah had accepted this reality as the price of her survival, building a life of quiet dignity around the understanding that her greatest victory would be remaining undetected until natural death claimed her. She had made peace with anonymity, found purpose in small acts of competence, and learned to measure success by days passed without incident rather than missions accomplished or lives saved. But deep within her psyche, the warrior remained dormant, rather than dead, waiting for circumstances that would justify the risks of revelation. Sarah Mitchell, the custodian, could accept disrespect and dismissal indefinitely, but Major Sarah Ghost Mitchell had sworn an oath to protect innocent life that transcended personal considerations of safety or anonymity. The question that haunted her quiet moments was not whether that oath still bound her, but whether she would recognize the moment when honoring it became more important than preserving the careful fiction of her peaceful existence. The answer would come sooner than she expected, carried on the morning news broadcasts. That would shatter the careful equilibrium of her hidden life and force her to choose between the safety of shadows and the dangerous light of purpose. The alarm clock's harsh buzzing at 3:47 a.m. never startled Sarah, awake because she had already been lying still for 20 minutes, her internal chronometer having awakened her with the precision that had once synchronized operations across multiple time zones. She allowed herself 30 seconds of conscious stillness, running through the mental checklist that had become her morning ritual. Apartment secure, neighbors quiet, no unusual sounds from the hallway or parking lot below. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive in hostile territories now protected her from more mundane but equally dangerous threats to her carefully constructed anonymity. Her studio apartment in Aurora revealed nothing about the woman who lived there. The furniture came from discount stores and garage sales, chosen for function rather than comfort or aesthetics. No photographs adorned the walls, no personal mementos cluttered the surfaces, no books or magazines suggested interests beyond basic survival. The refrigerator held simple foods that required minimal preparation, while the medicine cabinet contained only over-the-counter medications and basic first aid supplies. To any observer, the space suggested someone who existed rather than lived, someone who had given up on aspirations beyond getting through each day. But this apparent emptiness was itself a form of camouflage, carefully designed to deflect curiosity and discourage questions. The sparse furnishings concealed sophisticated modifications that only someone with extensive training would recognize. The bedroom window had been reinforced with ballistic film and fitted with blackout curtains that blocked both incoming light and outgoing surveillance. The front door featured additional deadbolts that had been installed during off hours and painted to match the original hardware. The bathroom mirror was positioned to provide a clear view of the parking lot, while the kitchen window offered sight lines to multiple escape routes. Sarah's morning routine had evolved into a meditation on controlled normalcy, each action performed with the mechanical precision of someone who understood that survival often depended on maintaining unremarkable patterns. She showered quickly, but thoroughly, washing away the night's accumulation of building chemicals and floor wax while running through mental exercises designed to maintain tactical awareness. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman approaching 40 whose brown hair showed threads of premature gray, whose green eyes had lost the sharp intensity that had once unsettled enemies and allies alike. The physical transformation that had accompanied her identity change went far beyond simple cosmetics. Sarah had deliberately gained 30 pounds through careful calorie management, adding bulk that softened her military bearing and disguised the muscle definition that had once marked her as an operator. She wore contact lenses that changed her eye color from the pale blue that had made her memorable to a common brown that drew no attention. Her hair, once kept in regulation styles that emphasized discipline and efficiency, now fell to her shoulders in a deliberately unkempt fashion that suggested someone who had stopped caring about appearances. But the most challenging transformation had been psychological, requiring Sarah to suppress instincts and reflexes that had been developed through thousands of hours of training and real-world application. She had to learn to walk without the confident stride that announced military bearing, to speak without the authoritative tone that commanded attention, to react to challenges with deference rather than the aggressive competence that had once made her formidable. Every interaction with other people became a performance, where she played the role of someone who had never commanded life-and-death situations or made decisions that affected national security. The bus ride to downtown Denver took 43 minutes, providing Sarah with time to observe and catalog the other passengers while maintaining the appearance of someone lost in her own mundane concerns. She carried a romance novel with a bent cover and dog-eared pages, occasionally turning pages while actually monitoring conversations and behavior patterns that might suggest threats to her security. The businessman in the third row spoke too loudly into his phone about confidential merger negotiations. The college student near the back displayed valuable electronics without awareness of the predatory attention she was attracting. The elderly woman by the window counted cash openly while preparing for her stop. Sarah's training made her acutely aware of human vulnerability, but her current identity prevented her from acting on observations that could save others from becoming victims. She watched as situations developed that could lead to robbery, assault, or worse, forced to remain passive while people she could have protected walked unknowingly into danger. The knowledge that her skills could prevent suffering while her circumstances prevented intervention created a constant tension between her true nature and her assumed limitations. Pinnacle Investment Group occupied 37 floors of Denver's Phoenix Financial Tower, its corporate headquarters serving as the nerve center for investment operations that managed over $40 billion in assets. The building's lobby featured marble floors, modern art installations, and security checkpoints that created an impression of sophisticated protection, while actually providing little real security against determined adversaries. Sarah entered through the employee entrance using her access card and submitting to the cursory bag search that had become routine since the September 11th attacks. The security guards who processed her entry each night knew her only as the quiet cleaning woman who worked the late shift, someone so unremarkable that they often forgot her presence within minutes of her arrival. This invisibility was precisely what Sarah had cultivated, understanding that the most effective camouflage was often hiding in plain sight among people who provided essential services while remaining socially invisible. She exchanged polite nods with Marcus, the overnight security guard who read mystery novels at his desk, and collected her cleaning supplies from the janitorial closet with the same methodical efficiency she brought to all aspects of her disguised existence. But while Sarah appeared to focus solely on her custodial duties, her trained awareness cataloged security weaknesses that would have horrified the executives who entrusted their lives to the building's protective measures. The loading dock access could be compromised by anyone with basic lock-picking skills. The emergency stairwells lacked proper surveillance coverage, creating blind spots that could be exploited by hostile forces. The elevator security system relied on outdated technology that could be bypassed with commercially available equipment. Most critically, the communications infrastructure that connected the building to emergency response services had single points of failure that could be targeted to isolate the building during a crisis. Sarah's work assignments rotated her through different areas of the building, providing her with comprehensive knowledge of floor plans, security protocols, and personnel patterns that would have taken intelligence operatives months to develop through traditional surveillance methods. She knew which executives worked late enough to be present during potential night attacks, which security measures were actually functional versus merely decorative, and which escape routes remained viable under various emergency scenarios. This information was cataloged automatically by training that had made her one of the most effective operators in Special Forces history, but it remained unused and unshared because revealing such knowledge would expose capabilities inconsistent with her assumed identity. The executive floors presented a particularly complex challenge for someone trying to maintain the facade of harmless incompetence while possessing advanced tactical knowledge. Sarah cleaned conference rooms where sensitive negotiations took place, emptied trash containing confidential documents, and worked around computer systems that controlled billions of dollars in financial transactions. Her security clearance had been permanently revoked, but her access to information that could destabilize markets or compromise national economic interests was limited only by her ethical constraints and her commitment to maintaining operational security. She observed executives whose arrogance and carelessness created security vulnerabilities that hostile intelligence services could easily exploit. Robert Chun, the company's chief executive officer, regularly conducted sensitive phone conversations without regard for potential surveillance, discussing merger plans and strategic initiatives that moved markets and affected thousands of jobs. His assistant left confidential documents on her desk overnight, while his personal computer remained unlocked and accessible to anyone with janitorial access to his office. These observations created a constant moral tension for Sarah, who understood that the information she encountered could be valuable to foreign governments, criminal organizations, or domestic competitors willing to pay substantial sums for insider intelligence. Her financial situation remained precarious despite 12 years of employment, her custodial wages barely covering basic living expenses while leaving nothing for emergencies or retirement planning. The temptation to monetize her access was real, but her ethical foundation remained strong enough to resist opportunities that would have compromised innocent people or national interests. Instead, Sarah found purpose in small acts of competence that improved security without drawing attention to her capabilities. She repositioned furniture to eliminate hiding places that could be exploited by attackers. She reported equipment malfunctions that created vulnerabilities, framing her observations as lucky discoveries rather than professional assessments. She ensured that sensitive documents left carelessly in conference rooms found their way to appropriate personnel, presenting herself as a diligent employee rather than someone trained to recognize classified information. These minor interventions provided Sarah with a sense of purpose that helped bridge the gap between her former life of significant responsibility and her current existence of deliberate mediocrity. She could not prevent major security failures or protect the building's occupants from sophisticated attacks, but she could address small vulnerabilities that might prevent opportunistic crimes or minor security breaches. The cumulative effect of these actions was probably insignificant, but they allowed her to maintain some connection to her protective instincts without compromising her carefully constructed cover. The social dynamics of her workplace provided Sarah with a laboratory for studying human behavior while practicing the interpersonal skills necessary to maintain her disguise. Her co-workers and the janitorial staff came from diverse backgrounds, many of them immigrants or people who had faced economic setbacks that prevented them from obtaining more prestigious employment. They treated Sarah with the casual friendship extended to someone who shared their circumstances, never suspecting that she possessed education and training that exceeded that of many corporate executives. Maria Gonzalez, who supervised the day shift cleaning crew, had become something approaching a friend during their brief interactions during shift changes. Maria's genuine kindness and work ethic reminded Sarah of the non-commissioned officers who had served under her command, people whose competence and integrity formed the backbone of military organizations. Their conversations remained surface level, focusing on work schedules and building maintenance issues, but Maria's respectful treatment of all personnel, regardless of their position, created an environment where Sarah could practice being valued for simple human decency rather than professional achievement. Tommy Rodriguez, a young security guard who had recently started working at the building, represented a different challenge for Sarah's assumed identity. His background as a military veteran meant that he possessed training that might allow him to recognize inconsistencies in her cover story or behavioral patterns that suggested more extensive tactical knowledge than she claimed. Sarah had to be particularly careful during interactions with Tommy, suppressing mannerisms and vocabulary that might trigger his recognition of her true background, while maintaining the friendly interactions that would be expected between fellow veterans. These relationships, while necessarily shallow, provided Sarah with social connections that helped maintain her psychological health during the isolation imposed by her hidden existence. She could not form deep friendships that might lead to questions about her past, but she could experience the basic human interactions that prevented complete social withdrawal. The challenge was maintaining these connections while constantly monitoring herself for slips that might reveal information inconsistent with her cover identity. Sarah's financial situation reflected the careful balance between maintaining her cover and preserving resources for potential emergencies. Her custodial salary provided enough income to cover basic living expenses without creating suspicion, but it left no room for luxuries or activities that might attract attention. She shopped at discount stores, lived in subsidized housing, and avoided expenditures that might suggest income sources beyond her declared employment. Her bank account contained exactly the amount that someone in her circumstances would be expected to accumulate through careful budgeting and modest savings. But this apparent financial limitation concealed resources that Sarah had accumulated through means that would not appear in any official records. She possessed precious metals that could be converted to cash without creating paper trails, cryptocurrency wallets that provided access to funds without banking oversight, and physical assets that could be liquidated quickly if circumstances required immediate relocation. These resources represented her insurance against the possibility that her cover might be compromised and she would need to disappear with minimal notice. The physical conditioning that had once been essential to her professional effectiveness now served the dual purpose of maintaining her health while providing psychological outlet for stress and frustration. Sarah's morning runs through Denver's empty streets allowed her to monitor her neighborhood for changes that might indicate surveillance or threats while maintaining the cardiovascular fitness that had been drilled into her through years of military training. She varied her routes randomly, never establishing patterns that could be exploited by hostile observation, while maintaining the appearance of someone exercising for simple fitness rather than tactical reasons. Her apartment's hidden exercise equipment allowed her to maintain strength and flexibility without drawing attention from neighbors who might wonder why a custodian possessed the physical capabilities of a professional athlete. She practiced martial arts forms in the pre-dawn darkness, maintaining muscle memory and reflexes that she hoped never to need again, while acknowledging that such skills might become necessary if her carefully constructed peace was shattered by unforeseen circumstances. The weapons cache hidden within her apartment's walls represented Sarah's ultimate insurance policy against threats that could not be addressed through evasion or legal means. She possessed firearms that could not be traced to her identity, ammunition sufficient for extended confrontations, and tactical equipment that would allow her to operate effectively if forced to abandon her peaceful existence. These preparations violated numerous federal and state laws, but Sarah had concluded that legal compliance was less important than survival if hostile forces discovered her location and attempted to eliminate the loose end that her continued existence represented. Sarah's information management reflected the same careful balance between preparedness and operational security that governed all aspects of her hidden life. She monitored news reports for developments that might affect her security, tracked personnel changes within military and intelligence communities that might create new threats, and maintained awareness of geopolitical situations that could motivate foreign intelligence services to target former American operators. This information was gathered through open sources and carefully anonymized internet access that could not be traced to her identity or location. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of her adapted existence was the psychological discipline required to suppress the competence and initiative that had once defined her professional identity. Sarah had been trained to identify problems and develop solutions, to take charge of situations that required leadership, to act decisively when circumstances demanded immediate response. Now she had to practice deliberate incompetence, accepting inefficiencies and vulnerabilities that she could easily address while maintaining the facade of someone whose capabilities matched her humble circumstances. This psychological suppression created internal tensions that sometimes threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained emotional equilibrium. Sarah would observe security failures that could cost lives, witness incompetence that endangered innocent people, and encounter situations where her expertise could prevent disasters, all while remaining passive and unremarkable. The knowledge that her skills could make a difference while her circumstances prevented action created a form of moral injury that she had not anticipated when designing her new identity. But she had also discovered unexpected sources of satisfaction in her reduced circumstances. The simple competence required to maintain her custodial duties provided a form of meditation that helped calm the hypervigilance that had been essential to her survival in hostile environments. The routine nature of her work created predictability that had been absent during her military career, when each mission brought unknown challenges that required constant adaptation and innovation. The absence of life and death responsibility, while frustrating to her protective instincts, also provided relief from the constant pressure that had characterized her former existence. Sarah had learned to find meaning in small accomplishments and simple human interactions, measuring success by her ability to remain undetected rather than by missions accomplished or lives saved. She took satisfaction in maintaining a clean and safe environment for building occupants, even though they would never know her name or appreciate her efforts. She found purpose in honest work, honestly performed, even though such work represented a dramatic reduction from her former responsibilities and capabilities. The 12 years she had spent building and maintaining this careful existence had taught her that identity was more fluid than she had previously understood. The woman who mopped floors and emptied trash cans was no less real than the major who had once commanded special operations missions, even though their capabilities and circumstances differed dramatically. Sarah had learned to inhabit both identities simultaneously, drawing on the strength and training of her former self, while living within the limitations imposed by her current circumstances. But this careful equilibrium depended on the continuation of circumstances that allowed her to remain invisible and unremarkable. Sarah understood that events beyond her control could shatter the peaceful existence she had constructed, forcing her to choose between the safety of her assumed limitations and the dangerous responsibility that came with revealing her true capabilities. She had hoped that such a choice would never be necessary, that she could live out her remaining years in quiet anonymity without ever again facing situations that demanded the skills she had worked so hard to suppress. The morning news broadcasts that would change everything were still hours away, but Sarah's trained intuition had already begun detecting subtle signs that her carefully ordered world was about to be disrupted in ways that would test every aspect of her adapted existence. Brad Stevens arrived at the Phoenix Financial Tower each morning in his silver BMW X7, pulling into the reserved parking space marked Director of Security, with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his right to occupy positions of authority. At 38, he possessed the kind of aggressive good looks that played well in corporate environments. Perfectly styled blonde hair, expensive suits that emphasized his gym-maintained physique, and a smile that conveyed both charm and barely concealed contempt for anyone he considered beneath his status. His corner office on the 35th floor overlooked downtown Denver, its floor-to-ceiling windows providing a view that he frequently used to remind visitors of his elevated position within Pinnacle Investment Group's hierarchy. Stevens had built his career on a foundation of family connections and political maneuvering, rather than professional competence or genuine expertise in security matters. His father, Congressman William Stevens, had served 6 terms representing Colorado's 5th Congressional District, using his position on the House Armed Services Committee to cultivate relationships with defense contractors and intelligence officials who could provide career opportunities for his ambitious son. His mother's family owned a chain of hotels throughout the Mountain West, giving Brad access to business networks and social circles that treated success as an inherited trait rather than an earned achievement. The security position at Pinnacle had been created specifically for Stevens, a custom-designed role that provided impressive title and substantial compensation while requiring minimal actual responsibility or accountability. The previous security arrangements had been handled by a combination of building management and local law enforcement contacts, a system that had functioned adequately for years without requiring a dedicated corporate security director. But Stevens' connections had convinced Pinnacle's leadership that a more sophisticated approach was necessary for a company managing billions of dollars in client assets, particularly given the increasing concerns about corporate espionage and terrorist threats that had emerged following various high-profile attacks on financial institutions. Stevens' educational background appeared impressive to those who failed to examine it closely. He held a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from the University of Colorado, where his academic performance had been mediocre, but his fraternity connections had provided access to alumni networks in law enforcement and corporate security. His master's degree in business administration came from a private institution known more for its willingness to accommodate wealthy students than for academic rigor. Most significantly, he claimed extensive training in corporate security and crisis management through various private consulting firms, credentials that sounded authoritative but represented weekend seminars and online courses rather than serious professional development. The gap between Stevens' claimed expertise and his actual capabilities became apparent to anyone with genuine security knowledge who observed his daily operations. His understanding of threat assessment was limited to checking items off standardized checklists provided by insurance companies and regulatory agencies. His crisis management plans consisted largely of contact information for emergency services and vague protocols that assumed external responders would handle any serious incidents. His personnel security procedures focused on background checks for new employees, while ignoring ongoing behavioral indicators that might suggest insider threats or compromised loyalties. Stevens compensated for his professional inadequacies through aggressive self-promotion and careful cultivation of relationships with Pinnacle's senior executives. He produced glossy reports filled with security industry jargon and statistics copied from trade publications, creating an impression of comprehensive, threat analysis while actually providing little useful information. His presentations to the board of directors emphasized the sophistication of his approaches and the unique threats facing financial institutions, using fear-based messaging to justify increased budgets for security consultants and technology. Systems that generated impressive invoices while providing minimal actual protection. His treatment of Pinnacle's employees reflected the casual cruelty of someone who measured his own worth by his ability to diminish others. Stevens divided the workforce into categories based on their perceived importance to his career advancement, treating senior executives with obsequious deference while regarding administrative staff, maintenance personnel, and security guards as barely deserving of basic courtesy. His interactions with people he considered subordinates were characterized by condescension, impatience, and a barely concealed belief that their circumstances reflected inherent personal failures rather than economic realities or systemic inequalities. The custodial staff represented the lowest tier in Stevens' mental hierarchy, people so far beneath his notice that he often behaved as if they were invisible. He would conduct confidential phone conversations in their presence, assuming that cleaning personnel lacked the intelligence or interest to understand sensitive corporate information. He left classified documents on his desk while custodians worked in his office, treating them as organic furniture rather than human beings capable of observation and analysis. Most revealing of all, he would discuss security vulnerabilities and protective procedures within earshot of janitorial workers, never considering that such information might be valuable to hostile actors or that the people emptying his trash might possess sophisticated understanding of the weaknesses he was inadvertently revealing. Sarah had observed Stevens' behavior patterns for 3 years, watching him demonstrate the kind of institutional blindness that created opportunities for sophisticated adversaries to gather intelligence and plan attacks. His assumption that social status correlated with intelligence or capability represented exactly the kind of vulnerability that foreign intelligence services trained their operatives to exploit. During her Special Forces career, Sarah had encountered numerous targets who possessed similar blind spots, officials whose arrogance and class consciousness made them easy to manipulate and compromise. Stevens' daily routine provided Sarah with extensive opportunities to observe his professional incompetence while maintaining her cover as an unremarkable cleaning woman. She emptied his trash, which often contained printouts of security assessments that should have been shredded or stored in classified containers. She dusted his desk, where he frequently left notes about personnel evaluations and budget allocations that revealed significant gaps in his understanding of actual security requirements. She cleaned his conference room after meetings where he discussed protective procedures with outside consultants, who appeared more interested in generating billable hours than addressing genuine vulnerabilities. The security office itself reflected Stevens' priorities and understanding of his role within Pinnacle's organizational structure. The walls displayed framed certificates from various training programs and trade associations, credentials that appeared impressive to uninformed observers but represented minimal educational value to anyone familiar with serious security training. His bookshelf contained popular press volumes about corporate security and crisis management, works written for general audiences rather than professional practitioners. His computer screen showed monitoring systems that provided basic surveillance of public areas while missing critical security zones and potential intrusion points. Stevens' relationship with the building's security staff revealed additional layers of his character and professional limitations. He treated the guards as uniformed servants whose primary function was to create an impression of security rather than provide actual protection. His instructions focused on appearance and customer service rather than threat detection and response. Procedures. He scheduled them for maximum visibility during business hours while leaving minimal coverage during overnight periods, when sophisticated attacks would be most likely to occur. Most problematically, He failed to provide the training and equipment necessary for guards to respond effectively to serious security incidents. Tommy Rodriguez, the young security guard who had recently joined Pinnacle's staff, represented a particular challenge for Stevens' management approach. Rodriguez's military background and genuine interest in security procedures created expectations for professional development and meaningful responsibility that conflicted with Stevens' preference for decorative rather than functional security. Personnel. Stevens addressed this conflict by assigning Rodriguez to the least important duties while making it clear that advancement within the security department would depend on accepting his authority without question rather than demonstrating competence or initiative. The tension between Stevens and Rodriguez provided Sarah with insights into both men's characters while forcing her to carefully manage her own interactions with the young veteran. Rodriguez's questions about security protocols and emergency procedures demonstrated genuine professional curiosity that Stevens interpreted as challenges to his authority. Sarah had to balance her natural inclination to encourage Rodriguez's development with the necessity of maintaining her cover as someone lacking relevant expertise or interest in security matters. Stevens' approach to vendor relationships and outside consultants revealed additional aspects of his character and professional philosophy. He preferred working with firms that emphasized presentation over substance, companies that produced impressive-looking reports and recommendations, while charging premium fees for relatively basic services. His consultant selection process prioritized personal connections and social compatibility over demonstrated expertise or track record of success. This approach resulted in security assessments that looked sophisticated but failed to address fundamental vulnerabilities that competent analysts would have identified immediately. The financial aspects of Stevens' security program reflected his understanding of corporate politics and budget management rather than genuine threat assessment or cost-benefit analysis. He consistently requested budget increases for visible security measures like additional guards and surveillance cameras, while neglecting less obvious but more critical needs, like communications redundancy and emergency response equipment. His spending priorities created an impression of comprehensive security, while actually leaving significant gaps that hostile actors could exploit during crisis situations. Stevens' personal lifestyle and social connections provided additional context for understanding his worldview and professional limitations. He lived in an expensive condominium in Cherry Creek, drove luxury vehicles that he replaced frequently, and maintained memberships in exclusive clubs that emphasized social networking over professional development. His recreational activities centered around venues and events that reinforced his sense of superiority over people who lacked similar financial resources or social connections. His romantic relationships followed similar patterns, involving women who enhanced his status rather than challenging his assumptions or encouraging personal growth. The contrast between Stevens' self-perception and his actual capabilities became most apparent during crisis simulations and emergency drills that he was required to conduct for insurance and regulatory compliance purposes. These exercises revealed his fundamental lack of understanding about how security incidents actually developed and how effective responses required coordination between multiple agencies and personnel levels. His scenarios were unrealistic, his timelines were inadequate, and his evaluation criteria focused on paperwork compliance rather than operational effectiveness. Sarah watched these exercises with professional horror, recognizing dozens of procedural failures and communication breakdowns that would prove catastrophic during actual emergencies. Stevens' approach to crisis management relied heavily on assumptions about external support and response times that bore no relationship to the realities of law enforcement and emergency medical capabilities in urban environments. His plans failed to account for communication disruptions, personnel casualties, or the kind of adaptive adversaries who would modify their tactics based on defensive responses. The most revealing aspect of Stevens' character was his reaction to criticism, or suggestions for improvement, regardless of their source or merit. He interpreted any questioning of his procedures or recommendations as personal attacks on his authority rather than opportunities for professional development. This defensive posture prevented him from learning from mistakes or incorporating lessons from other institutions that had faced similar challenges. More dangerously, it created an environment where subordinates were discouraged from reporting problems or suggesting solutions that might prevent future crises. Stevens' treatment of information security reflected similar blind spots and professional limitations. He used weak passwords on his computer systems, left sensitive documents accessible to unauthorized personnel, and conducted confidential conversations in areas where they could be overheard by people lacking appropriate clearances. His understanding of cybersecurity was limited to basic antivirus software and firewalls, leaving Pinnacle vulnerable to sophisticated digital attacks that could compromise financial data or facilitate physical security breaches. The intersection of Stevens' personal arrogance and professional incompetence created a particularly dangerous combination for an organization that might face sophisticated threats from foreign intelligence services or organized criminal groups. His assumption that his position and connections provided adequate protection against serious adversaries reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern security threats actually operated. Foreign intelligence operatives and professional criminals specifically targeted individuals like Stevens, people whose sense of superiority made them vulnerable to manipulation and whose professional limitations created opportunities for exploitation. Sarah's analysis of Stevens' vulnerabilities extended beyond his individual characteristics to encompass the institutional weaknesses that his appointment represented. Pinnacle's leadership had prioritized political connections over professional competence when selecting their security director, creating a situation where the person responsible for protecting the organization lacked the knowledge and skills necessary to recognize serious threats. This decision reflected broader corporate governance failures that could prove catastrophic if the company faced determined adversaries who understood how to exploit such weaknesses. The daily interactions between Stevens and the custodial staff provided Sarah with ongoing examples of his casual cruelty and institutional blindness. He would demand that cleaning be completed around his schedule without regard for the additional hours or weekend work this might require from people earning minimal wages. He complained about minor imperfections in custodial work while ignoring major security failures that competent assessment would have identified immediately. Most tellingly, he treated requests for basic equipment or supplies as personal impositions, rather than legitimate operational needs. Stevens' annual performance reviews and budget presentations revealed his skill at corporate politics while highlighting his professional limitations. He consistently received positive evaluations from superiors who lacked the expertise to assess his actual competence, while subordinates who might have provided more accurate feedback were never consulted about his effectiveness. His budget requests were approved based on his ability to frame security expenditures in terms that appealed to executive concerns about liability and regulatory compliance rather than genuine threat mitigation. The technological systems that Stevens had implemented reflected his preference for solutions that appeared sophisticated while requiring minimal ongoing expertise to operate. The surveillance cameras provided extensive coverage of public areas, but lacked integration with threat assessment protocols that would enable rapid response to developing situations. The access control systems created detailed logs of employee movements, but generated so much routine data that identifying anomalous patterns would require analytical capabilities that Stevens did not possess. The communication systems looked impressive but lacked redundancy features that would maintain connectivity during crisis situations. Stevens' relationship with local law enforcement and emergency responders reflected his assumption that external agencies would handle any serious incidents that exceeded his basic capabilities. He had established contacts with senior officials but lacked the operational relationships with frontline responders who would actually handle emergency situations. His emergency plans assumed response times and capabilities that bore little relationship to the realities of urban emergency services during major incidents. Most problematically, he had never conducted realistic exercises that would test coordination between Pinnacle's internal security and external response agencies. The contrast between Stephen's public persona and his private behavior became apparent to anyone who observed him during stressful situations or when he believed himself unobserved. His confident demeanor and authoritative speaking style masked deep insecurities about his professional capabilities and genuine fear of being exposed as incompetent. He compensated for these anxieties through increasingly aggressive assertions of authority and more elaborate displays of status and superiority. This psychological pattern made him predictable to anyone with training in behavioral analysis, creating additional vulnerabilities that sophisticated adversaries could exploit. Sarah understood that Stevens represented a systemic problem rather than merely an individual failure. Corporate America was filled with people who had achieved positions of responsibility through connections rather than competence. Individuals whose limitations created vulnerabilities that hostile actors could exploit to devastating effect. The challenge for someone in her position was maintaining professional distance from such incompetence while remaining prepared to act if Stevens' failures created situations that threatened innocent lives. The approaching crisis would test every aspect of Stevens' character and capabilities while forcing Sarah to choose between maintaining her cover and preventing the kind of catastrophic security failure that her training had prepared her to recognize and address. Stevens' reaction to genuine emergency would reveal whether his limitations were merely professional or extended to the kind of moral cowardice that abandoned responsibility when circumstances became challenging. For Sarah, observing his response would provide critical information about whether protecting innocent lives would require not only revealing her true capabilities but actively working around or against the person officially responsible for everyone's safety. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.